Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today during the day for a change versus our normal evening slot. We're so thrilled that so many of you are joining us from outside the United States today. And as the title suggests from our webinar, we're going to be doing global advocacy updates today. If you are not familiar that the No Way to Treat a Child campaign is a campaign beyond the United States, then today you will definitely learn about that. So my name is Jennifer Bing, and I'm going to be joined today by three of my colleagues from Defense for Children International Palestine, Shayna, Brad, and Miranda. And we had hoped to have Sausan joining us from the UK, but she had a medical emergency today, so isn't able to join us, but we will be doing an update based on her work, and she helped us prepare this webinar for you today. So Shayna, if you could go to the, yes. If you're joining us for the first time, you've reached the No Way to Treat a Child campaign. We do monthly webinars to inform all of you about our work on behalf of protecting Palestinian children's rights. A lot of our work is based in the United States around advocacy with our members of Congress. But as you'll hear today, we're also engaging with people in Canada and the UK and the EU on our campaign. Today, you're going to hear about things. If you go to the agenda, yep, there we go. We're going to do a brief update on what the conditions are for Palestinian children in detention right now in Palestine. And we're also going to talk a little bit about the International Criminal Court, the ICC. It's been in the news a lot recently. And because this campaign and particularly the work of DCI Palestine does intersect with some of those issues, we're going to talk about that briefly. And then we'll go to our global advocacy updates, where we'll hear from Shayna about the work she's been doing in Canada. The UK, Brad will speak based on the good work that Sausan has been doing. And of course, we will talk about the United States because we have some exciting news there as well. And we won't have Goofus and Gallant on today like we did last week, but we do have a special guest, Beth Miller, who's going to be joining us from Jewish Voice for Peace as we take on another debunking exercise, a common criticism that we have of the campaign, and we use that opportunity to help you think about good responses to critiques. So that's our agenda for today. As you can see, it's really packed. We hope that we get to questions at the end, but if we don't get to your questions today, you can always email us at info@nowaytotreatachild.org. So yeah, so let's get started. I think take it off to you, Shayna.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. And nice to see so many people here with us this afternoon, morning, evening, depending on where you are. So for those of you that join monthly, you know that we like to update you on the detention figures, which are typically provided by the Israel Prison Service, or IPS. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to get updated figures since September of last year. That's the last time that they released them to our partners at B'Tselem, who share them with us. And so we don't know exact figures. We do anticipate that the figures are around where they've been in previous months, somewhere between 150, 160 children. I also wanted to just draw your attention to a story that we recently covered, and maybe Miranda can drop the link into the chat, and we'll be sure to share it with you afterwards, about two young brothers from Hizma, northeast of Jerusalem, who were recently detained by Israeli soldiers for a period of hours, and accused of throwing stones. So the boys were playing outside of their house, riding their bicycles, when soldiers came and accused them of throwing stones, and forced the boys to sit on the ground for a period of time. And when family and neighbors tried to intervene, the forces started firing stun grenades and rubber coated metal bullets. Eventually, they took the boys to a military camp, and it wasn't until 10:30 at night that the boys were finally released to the Palestinian police, and ultimately to the care of their parents. The age of criminal responsibility under both Israeli civilian and military law is age 12. So those boys were too young to be charged with any crime. And really, I mean, no child, of course, should be detained, but these boys, especially because of their young age, should not have been detained even for the short period of time. So even though children younger than 12 are not kept in Israeli prisons, it still is a sign that children younger than 12 are impacted by Israeli military detention, and the trauma nonetheless impacts these children too. Um, so hopefully, yeah, Miranda, I see, dropped the link in. And now I'm going to pass it off to Miranda, who I'm excited to announce is joining our team full time starting on Monday. So we're very excited to be having her joining us full time. And Miranda's going to talk a little bit about the solitary confinement campaign that we've been running.
All right, thanks, Shayna. Hi, everyone. We're so glad you're here. I wanted to make you aware of a new petition we have on the No Way to Treat a Child campaign website that is organized around a report that Defense for Children International Palestine released very recently about the widespread and systematic use of solitary confinement in the Israeli military detention system against Palestinian children. So over the last 4 years, DCIP documented 108 cases of Palestinian children being detained in solitary confinement. And so this petition is organized targeting the leadership of the United States, Canada, and the UK to call upon Israeli authorities to immediately end this practice and enshrine that prohibition in law. So in just a minute, I'll drop the link to this petition in the chat, and we encourage you to share this with your networks. Thanks, Shayna.
Great, and thanks, Miranda. And now I think Brad is going to give us a little bit of an update on what's happening with the International Criminal Court and the news that we've been seeing recently.
Thanks, Shayna. So there's been a lot of news and developments over the past few months with the International Criminal Court as it relates to the situation in Palestine. So we just wanted to give it a little bit of an update since DCI Palestine is a legal representative of child victims before the court. So for background, folks probably are familiar that starting in 2015, the state of Palestine accepted the jurisdiction of the court and acceded to the Rome Statute. So the Rome Statute is the sort of legal instrument, the legal treaty that states agree to jurisdiction of the court and lays out the sort of jurisdiction of the court and the processes of the court, and the entire institution. Since then, the process has been essentially in a preliminary examination, which is the first sort of stage of any proceedings before the International Criminal Court. So the office of the prosecutor is essentially gathering information, doing a preliminary review of documentation that exists into crimes within the jurisdiction of the court. So the crimes within the jurisdiction of the court include international criminal law offenses. So you have war crimes, crimes against humanity, etc. So in the context of Palestine, and the 2014 war in Gaza, which was in many ways the impetus for the state of Palestine seeking a remedy through the International Criminal Court. This includes attacks on civilians, attacks against hospitals, unlawful killing, sort of a whole range of different criminal offenses under international law. What has happened sort of recently, to fast forward, at the end of 2019, December, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Fatou Bensouda, essentially made the determination that there was a reasonable basis to conclude their crimes within the jurisdiction of the court had been committed, and that the preliminary examination would end and it would move to the investigation stage. She has this authority to do that, and the investigation stage is still within the realm of the prosecutor's powers within the International Criminal Court. However, she also sort of asked the pretrial chamber, so a panel of 3 judges at the International Criminal Court, she asked them for a specific opinion related to, essentially, does the court have jurisdiction over the territory of the state of Palestine, which has been one of the main opposition points from the Israeli government and others arguing against the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction over crimes in the state of Palestine. So she asked for this in part to confirm that the court had jurisdiction, so that an investigation that she would then move forward with would have solid footing, at least in part. It's also a highly political sort of case before the court. So having others stand by her in sort of the legal conclusions that she's drawn is also, a way to sort of diversify the authority that comes with starting an investigation. So that was at the end of 2019. And then just a few weeks ago, I think February 5th, the pretrial chamber came out with their decision, essentially finding on the 3 questions asked that there is territorial jurisdiction. The court can essentially then proceed to investigate crimes occurring in territory that the ICC has jurisdiction over. This is the most recent development, which I guess that's not the most recent. The most recent is just last week, I suppose. The Office of the Prosecutor issued a statement stating that they are formally opening an investigation into the situation in Palestine. So that's sort of where things stand at the moment. I think for us as a local Palestinian organization involved in court proceedings stretching back to even before the January 2015 accession by the state of Palestine to the Rome Statute, right? This is a significant moment because the door remains open for accountability, for justice, for crimes that have been committed. There was I think a chance that that door could have been closed with the pretrial chamber decision. So it's good that did not happen. I think the prospects of anything moving quickly or having sort of robust accountability, justice of any sort at this stage is, most people probably aren't so optimistic, but I think the fact that the process continues and the prosecutor has moved to this stage as far as she had with the documentation that's been presented is a positive sign, and so we're hopeful that it continues to move forward. The other change at the moment is the prosecutor Fatou Bensouda. Her term is about to be finished in June. So in early February, a new prosecutor was elected by state parties to the treaty, and he is. We'll see, right? I think we're hopeful that a new prosecutor, right, with an ongoing investigation into the situation in Palestine, will have to engage with it in a genuine nature, with independence, and look at the documentation as it exists and draw conclusions from that, rather than kind of being pressured by more powerful states like the US, Germany, others, to kind of perpetuate impunity for crimes committed by both Israeli actors and Palestinian actors. So that's where things are. If you look at the graphic that Shayna put together on this slide, you'll see that it's still very early in the process. The investigation is sort of where the Office of the Prosecutor will start to look at specific acts and try to identify specific perpetrators, and that's potentially a difficult task. And then from there, it moves through the process: pre-trial stage, trial stage, and then appeal stage. It is a very long process, but it continues. So that's the quick update there. And I just want to mention that we're approaching the 3-year anniversary of the Great March of Return in Gaza, where hundreds of Palestinians were shot and killed by Israeli forces stationed on the other side of the Gaza perimeter fence. A number of the cases that we represent before the ICC involve children that were killed during these protests with live ammunition, representing their families and in the proceedings. So it's the idea of the ICC, I think, has been talked about kind of in a more abstract way, but for victims and for Palestinian families, the potential for justice and accountability is very personal. So we try to bring that realization to folks, I think, because in the end it is about human beings that are being impacted by specific acts, and demanding accountability that's been denied for so long. So I'll leave it there and pass it back to Shayna.
Great, thank you, Brad. So now just to give a brief update on our work in Canada, which is moving along nicely. And I see that 2 of the people who've really pushed forward our work in Canada are on this call. So I'm happy to see Chantel and Mervyn here with us. So in January, Chantel and Mervyn, who are members of the Oakville Palestinian Rights Association outside of Toronto, organized a meeting with their member of parliament, Pam Damoff, who's a Liberal member in the Canadian Parliament. And she was really taken by the stories and the documentation of child detention and its impact. And we asked her, what can we do? What do you think we should be doing in order to get this issue on the agenda of other members of parliament? And they came back to us, her team, and they suggested that we submit a briefing note to the Subcommittee on International Human Rights and also the Foreign Affairs and International Development Committee. Unfortunately, we've been told that the agenda is full in terms of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights doing a study, but we think that it still is important and useful to make sure that this agenda is on their plate and that they know that it's there. And to start applying pressure to encourage the government of Canada to act. So hopefully by the end of this week, we'll have submitted the briefing note to the committees, both the main committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, and also the Subcommittee on Human Rights. And we'll also be sending the briefing note to all members of parliament to make sure that they know that it's there, and to know what the issues are, and the impact of child detention, and to start pushing for the recommendations in the briefing note. And so we aren't quite there yet in terms of where you can take action, and I see that there are a number of folks from Canada on this call, which I'm very glad to see. So please stay tuned in terms of getting notification about taking action to reach out to your member of parliament and asking them to read the briefing note and to pass it on, and to encourage the Subcommittee on International Human Rights to take a closer look at this issue. And if you are involved in organizations that are working on human rights issues and Palestine specifically, we would love to have those organizations sign on as organizational endorsers of the briefing note, and to sign their name to a letter. So feel free to follow up with me about that. But we're excited to see that our work in Canada is moving ahead, thanks in large part to efforts of grassroots and those connected to their members of parliament. And it shows, I think, that what's really beautiful about this work that we're doing is that it really did come from constituents engaging with their member, and their member giving feedback in terms of what they thought was achievable, what they thought they could do, and also finding ways for member of parliament Damoff to support this work. So that's basically it. Yes, I see Connie's message. Can we share the briefing note? We will certainly share the briefing note once it is complete, and likely have that posted up on our No Way to Treat a Child website. We also, I don't know if we've mentioned this in past webinars, but we did do a little bit of reorganizing of the No Way website. And so there is a Canada specific section that folks from Canada should make sure to check out and stay apprised of. I think for now, the main action is to sign the solitary confinement petition, which is addressed to Justin Trudeau among other leaders. So that's it in terms of Canada. And now I'm going to pass it back to Brad to give maybe he'll do it in a British accent, though probably not, an update on our work in the UK and the EU.
Thanks, Jana. So on the UK updates, I'm filling in for our colleague Sausen, who couldn't be here. So I guess the main news for folks is that starting last August, we have a full-time staff member based in London that is primarily focused on growing the No Way to Treat a Child campaign, engaging with both organizations and individuals in the UK interested to carry this work forward. So sorry she couldn't be here to introduce herself and share more on her own, but no, if you haven't met Sausen yet or haven't been connected to her, you can write to us at info@nowaytotreatachild.org, and we can be sure to connect you. She's worked in a number of different capacities with DCI Palestine over the past 5-6 years, and has worked with a few different UK-based Palestinian rights organizations as well. So she's a great resource for us, and we're really happy to have her based in London to engage and sort of carry the work forward there. So that's kind of where we are and kind of where we're going. We're hoping to, in the same way that we've sort of built out in the US, kind of processes or vehicles to help facilitate moving conversations and awareness around the issues that we focus on in the No Way campaign forward. We're sort of trying to work with others in the UK to do a similar sort of sustained effort. So just as background, I think folks probably know there's a 2011 delegation to Palestine by a group of UK lawyers that then later in June 2012 published a really excellent report on the Israeli military detention system, the Israeli military court system. And I think even to this day, we still use that report with folks because it's really well done. The individuals that were part of that are very well respected. And there's been a lot of sort of follow-up to that report. There's been future, delegations that have been planned to follow up on the report. They've been canceled due to Israeli military sort of non-cooperation. So that in itself, right, thinking about a report that might feel not so high stakes in the moment is actually sort of over the years given us a way to facilitate conversations and hold debates, meetings, different things with MPs and the UK government since that report was issued. So there's still some strains of that happening. And trying to make that kind of more timely and useful moving into the future. Another thing, in 2017, there was an early day motion related to the ill treatment and prosecution of Palestinian children in Israeli military courts. It was widely supported, really big, strong numbers from MPs in the UK adding their name to that and signing on. We're considering with a few different organizations the possibility of an early day motion, but given some of the different challenges with people not being able to sign, not be able to table early day motions, we're trying to sort of see what the utility of is now and if it actually kind of is the best route forward. Another piece that we're looking at is just calling debates in Parliament. Where the issue can be raised, the issue can be focused on, bring the rights-based message and evidence-based rhetoric into that space to raise awareness and call for action. And another thing that I think goes across all of the contexts that we work in, right, is trying to, in some ways, exploit polarized party politics with the goal of eventually sort of having cross-party support for the core asks that we have and the core demands, right? That no child should be tortured, no child should be prosecuted in the military court system, etc. So there's different strategies and tactics that go into that, but the aim is sort of taking these narrow issues that we work on in the campaign and ensuring that, right, these are sort of baseline building blocks for a rights-based framework addressing Palestinian rights issues into the future. So I think I'll leave it there. The last piece I think on the UK is that just to flag a new report done by War on Want with another organization in Palestine called Advocacy. So Advocacy is a Palestinian human rights organization that focuses on legal representation to prisoners in the Israeli military detention system, as well as advocacy related to Palestinian prisoners' rights. So we work closely with Advocacy over the years, since we focus specifically on children in the military detention system, but they put out a new report just last week, I believe, focusing on the military court system, military detention system, military law system that for anybody, no matter if you're in the UK or elsewhere, is a good resource for just more information and detail on the system. And thanks, Shana. I forgot I had another slide just to run through the sort of where we're going. Southson's been meeting with MPs in the UK Foreign Office regularly. We're hoping to do sort of increasing webinars and building out partnerships with other organizations to sort of make sure that the issues sort of filter through the work that's already happening. So Thursday this week, the 11th of March, Southson and my colleague Ayed Abul-Iqtaish will be participating in a webinar with Kabu, Lawyers for Palestinian Human Rights, and the Save the Children. We'll also be hosting a fringe event with NEU. So we have a new partnership starting in the beginning of the year with the NEU Teachers Union. So we'll be focusing on education under occupation and sort of the impact of occupation on Palestinian children's right to education. Also in April, we'll be launching a new No Way to Treat a Child report that we're sort of finalizing now, that we hope is useful to everybody globally. It'll build on the 2016 report we released that was titled No Way to Treat a Child. So it'll be an update to that with new data over the past 5 years, and hopefully will be useful for everybody. Oh, so I'm sticking through for EU updates as well. Sorry that I'm talking so much. This is also the EU realm is covered by Sousan primarily, as she's the lead. A couple updates here. Over the past, I guess, probably 10 months, we've been engaging with a few sort of select members of European Parliament, sending specific letters related to the EU Subcommittee on Human Rights, related to Palestinian children in the military detention system and in the threat that COVID-19 faces or presents to children deprived of their liberty. We're also planning and working with our Defense for Children International Belgium to do a briefing for European Parliament, as well as a webinar on how people can get involved at the EU level, and then also working to start building out a bit of work in Belgium. So stay tuned for that. Reach out if you are interested in some of the EU advocacy. And I'll move on now. I realize that after the Canada updates, it's just all me. I wasn't looking at the run. Okay, so now, US. The US updates that we have for folks that I think most folks on this call know that over the past several years and the past 2 Congresses, we've had 2 pieces of legislation. So in 2017, we introduced HR 4391. That was the 115th Congress. And then in 2019, we had HR 80. Oh, no, sorry. The 116th Congress, we had HR 2407, which was another child detention focused bill. And then in 2020, in the summer last year, as annexation was being discussed and sort of the height of the Israel-Palestine sort of political sphere in the US, we introduced HR 8050, which was a specific aid use restriction bill preventing US funds from being used to deploy any materials, equipment, personnel, weapons into territory annexed by the Israeli government. So over the past few years, these 3 bills have worked to really facilitate engagement with members of Congress, raise the issue of military detention in a kind of mainstream way, I think we can say it at this point. So as we enter into a new Congress, the 117th Congress started in January this year. There's a number of new members of Congress that are progressive and sympathetic and already outspoken on Palestinian rights. We've been working to create a new vehicle, a new bill for this Congress. As we've been working with Representative Betty McCollum before in the previous Congresses, we're again working with her office to draft a new bill that we hope will be introduced in the coming weeks. I think we'll probably focus in April on specifically on the bill, because we hope it'll be finalized and if not already introduced, soon to be introduced before we have our next webinar. But generally, if you want to review some relevant bits, the HR 4391, which hopefully somebody can drop the link into the chat, to point people to. This bill has the sort of strategy that we'll focus on for the new bill. So aid use restriction bill saying essentially that no U.S. funds can support or be expended to support ill treatment, torture of Palestinian children, prosecution of children, military courts, etc. So we're working with the same prohibition that we've had over the years related to military detention, but the new bill will also kind of broaden the scope. So it won't solely be focused on ill treatment of Palestinian child prisoners. It'll focus also on the seizure, destruction, appropriation of Palestinian property and land, so home demolitions, and it will sort of roll in, hopefully, the HR 8050 prohibition around annexation, aid use restriction, so that no funds provided by the US can be used to further annexation of Palestinian territory. So hopefully in April, we'll be able to share more details. We're working to finalize things now, and then once we are finalized with the text and get things moving forward, and think about planning for introduction, get a date, and we'll be building out a bunch of new resources as well, so that folks in the US can engage with their members of Congress, reach out with the different talking points and actions that we'll launch. And then we also hope that we can find ways both in Canada and in the United Kingdom and the EU to really think about how aid use restrictions and sort of other vehicles like this can be used to facilitate that engagement that we need to just educate and make people aware of the human experience of Palestinian children that are detained by Israeli forces, but also the broader impact of occupation policies on Palestinian children and families. I think that's where I'll leave it. Hopefully I covered everything, but feel free, Shana, to jump in if there's something I left out.
No, I think that you were good and got everything in. I did forget to mention something, which I popped in the chat, and Mervyn also reminded me too, which is that I'm going to be participating in a webinar that Oprah is hosting on March 24th. That's looking, and remember, Oprah is not Oprah Winfrey, who's on everyone's mind this week, but the Oakville Palestinian Rights Association. That is looking at the impact of settler colonial policies on Indigenous and Palestinian children, a kind of Canada-Palestine comparison. So folks should check out Oprah's Facebook page for more information about registering, and hopefully we'll be able to send it out to our folks in Canada to join. I think with that, we can hand it over to Jennifer and our special guest, Beth, to talk about debunking.
Thank you, Shana and Brad, for covering so much material in a short period of time. And yes, we'd like to welcome Beth Miller. Beth, I don't know if you're able to turn your camera on so people can see
hi, everybody.
Who you are. There we go. Great. And Beth is no stranger to this work for sure, as she used to be our colleague here at Defense for Children International Palestine, and you know, hit the many congressional meeting and briefing and so forth around the various bills and dear colleague letters we've worked on in the last almost 6 years now. So welcome, and thanks always as well to all the members of Jewish Voice for Peace who've been so instrumental, as well as with engaging with their members of Congress to talk about this issue and others for Palestinian rights. So when we were thinking about what debunking myth that we come across in our work, we wanted to pick something that seemed pretty universal and would apply to our colleagues in Canada and the UK, as well. And of course, one issue that is being talked about quite a bit is anti-Semitism, as it should be. But the myth that we wanted to kind of deconstruct today is something we've heard a lot, which is that this campaign is anti-Semitic because it criticizes Israel. So as we've done in other debunking exercises, Brad or Miranda will post a poll in a minute, and you can select which of these three answers you, as our audience today, think might be the most, the best answer. And of course, all three of these answers, as we like to do, all of them might have some good things in them. It might have some less helpful things. So we're going to, I'll read them aloud since the type might be small for you, but then vote for us, and then we'll have Beth and Shana and Brad kind of comment maybe on which one they like the best, or what parts of each one, so we can, so let's get started. So the first one is, A, is conflating criticism of Israel and or Zionism with anti-Semitism is dangerous for many reasons, including the fact that not all Jews share the same view of Israel and Zionism. While we should absolutely challenge hatred and bigotry against Jews, that doesn't mean we should remain silent when Israel violates Palestinian rights. So that's A. B, anti-Semitism is discrimination against, violence towards, or stereotypes of Jews for being Jewish. It's an insidious form of bigotry that has been used to justify oppression and violence throughout centuries. Our campaign is about upholding international law and protecting Palestinian children, including holding the United States government accountable for $3.8 billion in military aid it gives to Israel each year. Or C, our campaign lifts up the rights of Palestinian children who face violence and abuse from the Israeli military occupation and violation of international human rights. People of all faith traditions in our campaign focus on the ways this violence is enabled by our governments through military aid and diplomatic cover for the State of Israel. Ignoring violations by the State of Israel would be holding it to a different standard than other nations. Okay, so I see that people are starting to vote. Excellent. Our poll is in progress. Beth, we try to wait till at least 75% of our audience vote before we launch in. Yeah. And we're getting there, close to our votes.
Is there ever Jeopardy music that plays?
Yeah, right. We sing a little song, we do a little dance. These are not short answers, so we recognize it takes a while for people to read them. But it does look like at this point, C is the third answer is getting the most support. Yeah, maybe why don't you launch in, Beth? So what if you were to pick one of the three? What do you think you'd pick?
This is like a super high stakes multiple choice. About like middle school anxiety mixed with like current job anxiety. It's all around this multiple choice question. First, let me just start by saying thanks for inviting me today. I'm really, I feel like I'm back at home on a No Way to Treat a Child webinar. Yeah, I would say that I think if I had to pick one, I would also lean towards C. So I really feel like the group has made a wise decision here. I think, you know, Jennifer, what you said before, I really love this exercise because I think it speaks to one of the challenges that's inherent in all of our work, which is that there isn't always just like one right answer, right? It's not a one size fits all thing. The truth is that when you are responding to this kind of statement, you have to assess a little bit, right? Like, who are you talking to and what are they really trying to say to you? Those are the questions you have to ask yourself. And so, you know, it's different when you're thinking about, are you meeting with a member of Congress, or are you meeting with a member of Congress's staffer? Or, you know, maybe you're having this conversation around the dinner table, or you're having it at a meeting with other activists, or you're having it at your church or your synagogue or your mosque, or, you know, you're having it in community in some other way. In all of these places, you need to kind of think about, okay, when this person says that the No Way to Treat a Child campaign is anti-Semitic because it singles out Israel, who are they? Who are they? Oh, it looks like C really won. Cool. Who are they and what are they really getting at here? And so I'm gonna speak a little bit to each of these for sure, but also kind of wanted to just ground in a few core ideas that when I'm doing this work as a representative of a Jewish organization, what I like to kind of keep in mind when I think about these things. The first is that any response like this, where the response is to say that this is anti-Semitic, whether it's because it's singling out Israel or for some other reason, and mostly this attempt to kind of critique the Palestinian rights movement by saying that it's anti-Semitic to call for Palestinian freedom or demand Palestinian rights in any way, including this particular criticism, it's rooted, whether or not people realize it or not, it's rooted in an idea that Palestinians and Jews cannot be safe at the same time. That's like at the core of all of this, right? At the core of any and all of this, the like conflation of Israel and Israel's actions with Jews everywhere is the idea that if Jews are going to be safe, Palestinians can't be safe, right? They have to live under occupation. We reject that. And that is important for us to remember and keep at the core of everything we say, because it's easy to get lost otherwise. And it's easy to get thrown off course and thrown off of your messaging if you aren't remembering like kind of your compass on all this. At the core of what we're doing is we're saying Palestinian children can live free, safe, happy lives, and so can Jewish people. Right? Like those two things are not in contrast with one another. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing that is always useful to keep in mind with this particular criticism is that we are not singling out Israel. Israel does this stuff all by itself, right? Like the Israeli government is the only country in the world that automatically and systematically detains children in a military court system. It's not our fault that they're the only ones doing that and that we want to talk about it. And if you're in the US in particular, you've got a government that provides Israel with unconditional military funding. And it's the only government that we give funding to that is completely unconditional with no human rights conditions whatsoever. So once again, we are not the ones singling out Israel. Israel's doing this all by itself, and the US government is paying for it in a way that is exceptional. Those are some of the things that are core to keep in mind. And then the other thing that I wanted to just kind of name and speak to a little bit, because I think it's easy to, when someone says something like this, it's really understandable that our initial reaction is to like go on the defense, right? Because we are all activists who've been part of this movement for a long time. And so we know that this smear is coming at us. And when it does, it's offensive and it's horrible, and we want to fight back against it. And we should. And when I mentioned before about kind of assessing the situation, I would really like to encourage all of us, and this of course really depends on like, there's a lot of different people on this call, so you know who you are, you know where you're coming from and all this. If you feel like it's appropriate for you, and depending on who you're talking to, take a minute to also think about like where is this person really coming from, right? Like for me, I've had conversations with members of Congress or staffers where they say this, and I'm like, okay, you are regurgitating an AIPAC talking point to me right now. You don't believe this, you don't care about this, this is BS, and we're just gonna drive through it. And I've had conversations with family members where they say something like this to me, and I know that it's rooted in like a fear that they have in a different way. And you don't respond to both of those two things in the same way, right? Like you should, one of those things deserves a different kind of response than the other. And so I just want to like name that too, that this isn't like in the same way that our responses aren't all the same, places comes from isn't all the same. The impact is always the same though, which is again, that assumption that Palestinians and Jews cannot be safe at the same time. So moving through these particular ones, and again, Brad and Shayna, I don't know, we didn't talk about the exact facilitation of it. Like if you want to just hop in at any point, or should I just, yeah, okay, cool. The first one, I think that there's like good pieces and tricky pieces in all of this. And so with regard to the first response, conflating criticism of Israel and or Zionism with anti-Semitism is dangerous for many reasons, including the fact that not all Jews share the same view of Israel and Zionism. While we should absolutely challenge hatred and bigotry against Jews, that doesn't mean we should remain silent when the Israeli state violates Palestinian rights. There's a few things that I do really like about this answer that I would want to hold on to, especially in meetings with government officials, right? On the one hand, it's a nice reminder that their comment is rooted in a falsehood, right? The Israeli government and Jewish people are not the same. And that's a great thing for us to always remind everyone of. I am Jewish and I'm American, and I have absolutely the Israeli government has no say over what I do or who I am. We are separate and disconnected. Those two things are not the same. The other thing that's great to mention is that like this is about the Israeli state violating Palestinian rights. This is a rights-based issue. The thing that I don't love about this response is honestly that I think we often all do this. Just like simplify the language. When you're talking to people, I would just recommend saying, you know, the Israeli government and Jews are not the same. We're talking about the Israeli government. Put it aside and then get back to the point. One thing that always happens is that people try to just derail you. Again, you want to assess where you're at, but assuming that this is an attempt to derail you, don't get drawn too much into the weeds of the conversation about conflating these two things. Stick to the point. You are there to talk about the detention of Palestinian children, the ill treatment and torture of Palestinian children, and you will not be knocked off your guard. The second one I think is particularly good for when you're talking with someone who you think they do genuinely want to talk with you about anti-Semitism too. And again, this has to do with that assessment, right? Like, are they just trying to like kick you off your talking points, or are they actually looking to engage in a conversation with you, right? Sometimes a little bit of a yes and is a really useful thing when you're trying to move someone. So I think, again, we get defensive. Sometimes when someone, if someone's really, and again, this is when someone's really trying to engage you in a conversation in a useful way. Sometimes someone will say, you know, I'm afraid like this is anti-Semitic. There's a lot of anti-Semitism in the world. And this feels like it's anti-Semitic because it's singling out Israel. And of course, you know, Palestinian kids shouldn't be tortured, but anti-Semitism. And if you just barrel past the fear around anti-Semitism and just head straight for the other thing, you're actually not going to move them either, right? You want to engage where you can meet too. And we can meet on the idea that anti-Semitism is a terrifying thing. That is true and real. And anti-Semitism is rising in this country right now. Neo-Nazis literally just stormed the Capitol. We can all agree that anti-Semitism is a huge problem in this country. And so it's a really useful conversational tool to acknowledge that fear and meet them where they're at with that fear and show them that you too do care about anti-Semitism and say what you think, you know, yes, anti-Semitism is really scary and we need to be dealing with it. Right now, we're here to talk about this other particular issue, and it's disconnected from anti-Semitism because it doesn't have to do with Jewish people. It has to do with the Israeli military, and those two things are separate. And then you can kind of go back to your points. But again, thinking about who are you talking to, and do you want to give them a little, you know, a little meeting them where they're at some point too, and recognizing that for a lot of people, you know, anti-Semitism is another form of oppression, bigotry, and racism, and so a lot of people come to this issue with a different kind of trauma, and it never excuses when the impact of it is the oppression of Palestinians ever. But if your job is to try to move them, then you can think about like, how do you meet them in that way to then move them to you? So that's kind of one of the things I do like about that second one. And then the third one, yeah, I also like C, I think the best as well, largely because it, again, doesn't get derailed, right? This is a great answer if you are in a meeting with a member of Congress and you've got 15 minutes and they just threw an AIPAC talking point at you to basically just go through it. You know, you want to basically say, we're not singling out Israel. There is a very real human rights issue that is happening here. We are here to talk with you about it, just like we would want to talk with you about any other human rights issue happening anywhere else in the world. Israel does not deserve special treatment, right? Israel deserves to be treated like every other government, every other nation state in the world, which means it deserves to be held accountable. And we don't want to pay for or insert, you know, whatever your ask is there, this particular practice. And so I think that's a really useful thing, especially when you're doing government advocacy, to just stick to the point and don't get derailed from what you're talking about. Those are my initial responses to those kind of 3 points.
That was
Thanks.
awesome, Beth. Brad and Shayna, do you have anything you would add?
There's not a whole lot to add to Beth going through that. And that's super helpful, I think, for folks. The one thing just to maybe make it more concrete, right? Like thinking of, and this is generally applicable to, I think, arguing or debating or sort of just any rhetoric around a contentious issue, is that derailing that Beth speaks of, right? It comes, I think, the being proactive in responses is in, you know, keeps you on that path. A lot of this, you know, these responses, and I think I lean towards C because it doesn't accept the premise of the statement, right? It doesn't engage with it in the same way that, right, a response directly to the anti-Semitism allegation would, right? It's, no, I'm sorry, our campaign lifts up the rights of Palestinian children, and then, you know, measured by international law, and then I care about this because my government supports it in the form of impunity or in actual dollars. So I think it's important to, like, for maybe some of the more non-genuine opposition points that come back, right, is to think about how you can engage in a way that doesn't kind of legitimize the allegation or the question's premise that undermines the work. Because I think if you do that, you'll automatically just be digging a hole, right? And then you're constantly trying to get back on the rails. But if you just sort of think clearly about not accepting the premise, right, and move forward, as Beth said, you'll see that you can sort of keep on message, focused, and you won't get derailed and pulled kind of to the side there. So I like, this is probably one of the harder debunking pieces that we've done, because there's not a right answer, right? It varies depending on the person you're engaging with, what the context is, and sort of the genuineness of the person. I think, I don't know, Beth, if you wanted to just say something briefly about the IHRA definition, just to like ground it a little bit, since this is in part the reason we decided to focus on this today.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. So just a note that, you know, this kind of comment is part of a much broader trend that we have all seen and experienced, which is the weaponization of false claims of anti-Semitism to silence and censor the Palestinian rights movement. And there's one particular tool that is kind of the favored tool of anti-Palestinian groups right now, and it's something called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, IHRA for short, IHRA or IHRA for short. That definition is that you all have actually probably seen and encountered this definition many times over, even if you didn't hear it referred to as the IHRA definition. This is the definition that was baked into legislation such as the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which came up in the last several Congresses. It was the definition that was baked into Trump's executive order that claimed to combat anti-Semitism back in December of 2019. And those were all pieces of legislation or executive orders that basically sought to force universities to refer back to this definition, and rather the DOE to refer to this definition when investigating possible incidents of anti-Semitism. Essentially, the IHRA definition is a definition that on the one hand is entirely too broad to ever be of any use in fighting anti-Semitism. It's like the definition itself is like if you looked up anti-Semitism in the dictionary, like it's not useful. And along with that, there are 11 examples of anti-Semitism, 7 of which have to do with Israel. So the other piece of it that's wrong, in addition to not being fit for purpose because it's too broad, is that it effectively is only useful in silencing Palestinians and combating and censoring Palestinian activists. That's really the only thing it's any good for. And there is a wide-ranging attempt to codify it into law at the municipal level, at the state level, and at the federal level. And so that's something that we are all should be aware of and be pushing back against. And comments like this are pulled directly from the IHRA definition, which says things like, treating Israel differently or holding Israel to a double standard, right? That you wouldn't hold other countries to as anti-Semitic. Flawed for many reasons, including the fact that it's not a double standard to hold them to human rights law. But this criticism comes from IHRA. I can share out with the facilitators, we have a 1-pager on IHRA that JDP Action uses, and we're talking to members of Congress so that you all can do a little more reading on it as well. But just to note that, again, comments like this are part of a broader campaign to smear this movement. And this definition is a really useful tool for the groups that are doing that.
Thank you, Beth, and everyone. We are at time. Once again, it's great to see so many of you joining us for our monthly webinars. On the next slide, you'll see that our webinar next month is going to be a little early, April 6th. The 13th, the second Tuesday is usually when we do our sessions, but that will be the first night of Ramadan. So we're hoping by April 6th next month, we'll have a bill a congressional bill to discuss with you in more details, and probably spending a little bit of time debunking what we anticipate might be some of the pushback. So thank you all so much for joining us today. As you know, we will send a follow-up email with a recording of this webinar and the slides so that you can use that in your activism. And yeah, thank you for taking time to be with us today from around the world. Thanks.